You know, what about icebergs over here? So it's the volcanic rock that he's just scratching. You will need to continue to come to as many of these conferences as you can, because the information that you're getting is going to be voluminous, and at the same time to try to understand it, you know, in one day is impossible. And so it's repetition that's necessary for you to hear it and then start to do your own homework and research so that it'll start to sink in. It is very important, and I'm really happy to see all of you here, because what this is telling me is that more and more people are interested and wanting to learn all of the factual information that's coming out. It's very important. And again, taking it back, how many of you remember seeing Iz's album when he went solo? And the picture that he took on the front of the album. Do you know what that meant? Wava'a mahope. You have to look back into your history in order for you to move forward. That's what that picture meant. And so this is what all of you are doing right now here. You're going back into the history of what happened so that we can answer questions like you have to move forward. What's going to happen to my land? What's going to happen to us here? It's very, very, very important. The thing that I'm really proud of is our small group that we have. ʻAha Kānaka Moku Keawe. And we're all about volunteers in trying to put these conferences together. And so we don't go to Office of Hawaiian Affairs or Office of Hawaiian Despair to try to get money. We don't go to the state, we don't go to the county. We raise our own monies our own way, whether it's going to be to sell Kalua pig, or whether we're going to make 1,600 laulaus and sell the 1,600 laulaus so that we have enough money to bring these experts over here to the island, you know, so that they can share their mana, you know, with all of us. So, in back there, and this is non-paid political announcement, we're selling t-shirts, the Deakipa Hawaii t-shirts, and the proceeds go to help to offset the expenses that we have, as well as we also have Dr. Keawe's history book. Now that, we're just selling it at cost. If you do not have that book, you need to have that book in your home. Because to me, that's the Hawaiian History Bible. And that book is a scaled down information of his dissertation. And when I read his dissertation for the first time, this was several years ago, about 8 years ago, I stayed up all night to read that 300-page dissertation. And that book is a scaled down version of it. And I always go back to refer to that book to make sure I got the right information on Hawaiian history. So we have that available. We picked up a case of that for those of you who are interested in getting the book. The other thing that we also have is that we need to raise money for the Hawaiian Kingdom government, because the Hawaiian Kingdom government is involved in international proceedings, especially with the international courts. And we have to, the Hawaiian Kingdom has got to pay the cost of those court proceedings. How many of you remember the South China Sea's case with China and the Philippines? This happened just a few months ago. Okay. And this is where the Philippines took China to court because they created and they made this artificial island right in the middle of the South China Seas. So that what they could do is they could tax all of the ships that would pass close within their boundary area. which meant that all of the ships that sailed in the China Sea. And that affected all the other countries around it. Okay, so the Philippines took China to court. And from that, you have any idea how much it cost the Philippines to take that case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration? Does anybody have any idea? It was $30 million that it cost China to take, cost the Philippines to take China to court. We need to raise money in order to do that so that we can now take the United States and those that are committing war crimes to the same courts. So in order to do that, the Hawaiian Kingdom government is now in the process of asking you to buy Hawaiian Kingdom bonds. And those bonds is an investment in the country, in the future, and Dr. Sai will be talking more about it in his presentation. So we have that up in, yes.
As a trust, as Keawe holds the trust of the Hawaiian Kingdom, how come we cannot use our money to pay for our way, the same way they stole our land? Since he's holding our trust as the governor, which is, you know that.
Yeah, the issue with that.
How come we cannot use that money that we have to fight there?
Okay, the issue with that.
Don't we have the rights to that?
Okay, where do we take that? Where do we take? Where do we file that case? The problem that we have, okay, is that we try to minimize or eliminate us having to use U.S. courts. Okay, because the U.S. courts have no jurisdiction in the Hawaiian Kingdom.
So why do they have
so it's a catch-22. But I'll leave that for Dr. Sai. Okay. All right. So how many of you got this? Okay, can you tell me how many national anthems the Hawaiian Kingdom has? Okay, one person said one. Anybody else want to take a shot at this? Okay, somebody said 3. The number of national anthems that the Hawaiian Kingdom used, and I didn't know this until just about a year ago, I started learning about this. 4. There were 4 national anthems that the Hawaiian Kingdom used prior to the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The first official national anthem was the national anthem of England, God Save the King. Then the king at that time asked that it be translated in Hawaiian. And so the second national anthem was translated in Hawaiian. The third national anthem was written by Princess Lili'uokalani. He mele la hui Hawaii. Okay, the song of the people throughout the islands. And only now is that being recorded, as a second national anthem. And then when King Kūʻokoʻa came to power, he wanted to change the national anthem. So in 1867, the new national anthem was written. And that was Hawaii Po'oloi. Okay. If you have this card, read the back of the card. And in the back of the card, it gives you the translation. And what's so unique about this, and again, when I went to Kamehameha, they never broke this down for us. And they only had us sing one verse that the state of Hawaii has. And we never knew what Hawaii Po'oloi was, except we could sing it. But when it was written by Kūʻokoʻa, he wrote it for the purpose of the 3 groups of people that were in the Hawaiian Kingdom. The first group, of course, was a monarchy. The second group was a Konohiki. And the third group of people that he addressed in the national anthem were the Maka'ainana. This is why this Hawaii Pono'i is so important for us and that we sing it properly. And every time we sing it, this is our national anthem. So at this time, I would like to ask all of you to stand with this card and let's sing Hawaii Pono'i. And if you don't know the words, on the card, write it back. Hawaii Pono'i, Manali Pono'i, Kamani Ali, Keawe, Makualani e Kamehameha na kawa e pale me kai e Hawaii Pono'i Manali Nali na Kūʻokoʻa na hoki Makualani e Kamehameha e na kawa e pale me kai e Hawaii Pono'i e kalahui e o kauhananui e ui e Makualani e Kamehameha e na kawa e pale me kai e. Wow! And this is a good segue for me to introduce our next speaker. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker to you because he really helped me in understanding today the term Hawaii.
Instead of in front?
Okay.
How would you like for
Let me ask you this question.
In front, okay.
How many of you have ever gone to Honolulu International Airport and as people from America getting off the plane, you ask those people, hey, how much American you? How many of you did that? I know, because I never do until I started learning what it was. Okay. However, it's okay for other people to come up to a Hawaiian and say, hey, how much Hawaiian you? And of course, the Hawaiian's going to be proud. Or you get half. Or you get 3/4. Or you know what, tutu man, you go da 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 da. And so we're so proud. How many of you ever thought to respond and say, why are you asking me one racist question? It's okay for the Hawaiians for us to accept a racist question like that. But you try to do that at Honolulu International Airport with all the people coming off from America, and you ask me, how much American are you? This is a difference in what Willie Keawe and the research that he's come up with has made for us to really understand this. Because it was totally different back in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And we need to, again, kawama hopi. Start thinking, if we're going to think Hawaiian, start thinking of how our ancestors were thinking prior to the overthrow. But right now we're thinking American. Because we've been so Americanized. And Dr. Willie Keawe provides us the line. Willie Keawe.
family for inviting us here for this day. All of you. As well too. And all the volunteers and the beautiful Yakupai Hawaii shirts. Great to see. My name is Willie Koi, from the island of Maui. I live in Oahu. I currently am a faculty member at the University of Hawaii. Currently, I am the director of Native Hawaiian Student Services, which basically puts our unit in charge for providing for the support, the recruitment, and retention of the approximately 2,700 Hawaiians that attend UH. And I'll spend a little time talking about the importance of that, the importance of our presence, especially in Hawaii's only research institute. Right? I think it's important to note that the University of Hawaii Manoa is our only research-intensive university. Unfortunately, however, we have historically we've had low numbers at UH Manoa. It's actually one of the institutions in which we have the lowest amount of enrollment. Hawaiian students are much more overrepresented in the community colleges and underrepresented at UH Manoa. Considering the research that we have for you today, right? Donovan's research comes out of the University of Hawaii, Dr. Sai as well, Dr. Ron Williams, Dr. Niklaus Schweitzer, right? The University of Hawaii Manoa is a place in which Native Hawaiians need to start having a much more greater impact, right? And not just because it's a moral dilemma for the university to take care of, but because what we bring to the plate, what our research and what our scholarship brings is not just good for Hawaiians, but all of Hawaii. On that note, if you had seen this, there's a handout here. It's a Kūʻokoʻa handout. At Native Hawaiian Student Services, we've made it an effort to begin to celebrate, to pull the University of Hawaii Manoa and into celebrating our national holidays, making that something that's on the university's radar. Right? For us, when we can start celebrating Kūʻokoʻa, the University of Hawaii Manoa, to us that's possibly one of our greatest recruitment efforts of our appeal into this school. So as you can see here, there's a little bit of our program. We got a little sassy with it. We borrowed some of the font from some of the older newspaper that we've seen in the 19th century. But throughout, there's excerpts that we've pulled from various years within the 19th century that talk about how Kūʻokoʻa was celebrated. Right? In many ways, it was celebrated just like this, right, for the past 175 years. By the coming together of these political speeches, there's luau's. There's also quite a lot of bit of information about Ha'alilio, right, and William Richards, who we all know spent are pivotal for this particular day. Right, they were the two primary envoys that traveled across the world to secure Hawaiian independence. There's also a copy of the Anglo-France Proclamation. Right, Anglo-France Proclamation is the treaty that recognizes and secures Hawaiian independence. In 1843. There's also an extensive list of all the treaties that we have. So please take some time to look through this. This was actually an outreach teacher's guide that we've been using to go to the different schools, particularly in Oahu, to pass out to teachers who might be interested in celebrating or teaching about this particular day. So if you haven't had one, I think there's a few up there. Please help yourselves. So my dissertation looked at citizenship in Hawaii. How many of you in here have read a book about Hawaiian citizenship? Which book? Yeah. It's kind of a trick question. It's a trick question because there isn't a book on Hawaiian citizenship, right? There's very little written on the topic, right? And so in many ways, this dissertation that I wrote in 2014 in the political science department was one shot at looking at this question, right? What is the legal and political evolution or history of citizenship? You listened to Donovan quite extensively talk about the mahele. I'm going to do similar to that, but in the context of citizenship. This is the title of my dissertation. Sorry, not the rise of Hawaiian nationality, but the color of nationality, continuities and discontinuities of citizenship in Hawaii. Given that we're on Hawaii Island, right? I'll pose, I think, what should be maybe a simple answer or a simple question. How come we're called Hawaiians? How come our nationality or our citizenship is called Hawaiian? The colonizers? Not the colonizers. Why are we not called Mauians or Mawaiians or Oahuans?
Because we come from the island chain.
Kamehameha is the progenitor of the kingdom, right? He is the founder of the kingdom, exactly. Kamehameha is born here on this island, right? And so in that sense, what ends up happening, right, is Hawaii Island consolidates or gobbles up the rest of the kingdoms, right? It's Hawaii Island is the progenitor of the Hawaiian kingdom, right? Hence the word Hawaiian.
So why are they forcing us to say natives?
Excuse me?
Why are they forcing us to say natives?
Yeah, good, and that's maybe something we can get into, right? Because the term Hawaiian today, right? I can throw this out, has a completely different definition and meaning than it had in the 19th century, right? Today, our understanding of the term Hawaiian is through the lens of American racial ideology, right? A racial system that, as I'll show in my presentation, had a hard time surviving here, right? The American racial ideology that we see still to this day, right, which in many ways has denied citizenship, has denied rights, has denied certain basic understandings of civil human rights to people of color, right? We have a completely different history, and we can look at this history through a better understanding of citizenship, right? So what this presentation I think will do will provide us a better understanding of citizenship, but it's also going to provide an analysis of race, right? How is it that we come to understand the term Hawaiian today in the same context as Black Power? Right? That's something that's foreign to us. So I'm originally from the island of Maui. My dad comes from a long line of Paniolo. My dad, as you can see, he fulfills most of the racial stereotypes of what a Hawaiian is supposed to look like. Right? What do Hawaiians look like?
Good looking.
Good looking. That's not a stereotype. That's it.
I can't argue that one.
Yeah, handsome. Right? But some of the racial stereotypes, right? What is a Hawaiian supposed to look like? One of the main prerequisites in Hawaii is skin color, right? Somebody like my father, right? His identity as a Hawaiian wasn't questioned, right? Wasn't questioned. But when it came time, right, for me, and Kale asked that question, right, to answer this question, what nationality are you? When you respond to this particular question, right? Usually in Hawaii, and this is a question that you're almost guaranteed to be asked while growing up in Hawaii. The other is, what school did you grad from? Right? These are the two questions that give people hints and clues and a better understanding of who you are and where you came from. But this term nationality, this understanding what nationality you was different, right? Because whenever the person who's asking, right, and I respond with I'm Hawaiian, there's always a follow-up question with, how much Hawaiian are you? Right? And for me, that's a difficult question to respond to. In particular because I only knew my dad as being Hawaiian. I only knew his parents, my grandparents, his mom and dad as being Hawaiian. My birth certificate says that he's Hawaiian. But I never, ever, in growing up in Hawaii, told somebody or revealed to someone I'm 50% Hawaiian. Because what happens after that? Labels, right? Full of shit. Even to the point where, even when I say I'm 20%, right? I'm 20%. Even people still second guess that, right? And so you see this continual downward slide of where we're headed when we start entering into conversations of race, right? And when did the conversation or discussion of blood quantum come up in Hawaii? It wasn't in the 19th century. It wasn't in the Kingdom era. When was it?
Homeland area.
Homeland, right?
Yeah.
Department of Hawaiian Homelands, right? It's one of the first moments, 1920, in which the term Hawaiian is now being used to define or used to connote race or ethnicity. Right? So a very difficult question for me to ask, right? And none of us growing up ever said the correct response, which is what? What is the correct response to this? Hawaiian. Hawaiian is a nationality. Hawaiian is the term used in the 19th century to describe a subject, right, or a citizen of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The term Kanaka is actually used in the census to describe somebody who is pure blood, right, a pure-blooded Hawaiian national. So one of my dissertation topics or questions, right, what it really sought to do was to answer this question, right? In light of the United States illegal occupation, who comprises the Hawaiian citizenry today, right? So considering that we've been occupied for 120 years, right, and we've been inundated by foreigners, right, through this occupation, how do we come to an understanding of who then comprises the Hawaiian national population today? How do we do that? What do you think we need to do? Sit in this room and all come up with a definition by ourselves, or we got to go back into history, right? History will provide the lens to give us an understanding of how to answer this particular question, right? And this is, I would argue, a particular question that is of great significance. Right? It's a question that I really could only shine some light on, and is much more deserving of much more research. But this will be somewhat of our guiding light in this presentation. Before we jump too far back into the 19th century, one of the first places in which we see this idea of the Hawaiian Kingdom being in continuity. Right? 1994, State of Hawaii versus Lorenzo. It's an ICA, it's an Intermediate Court of Appeals case in which Lorenzo is saying to the judge, right, this is in 1994, that you don't have jurisdiction over it, right? Partly because the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist, right? And as a result of that, I am a subject, I am a citizen of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which is now being currently occupied, right? This is one of the first moments in which this understanding of a continuity of Hawaiian sovereignty and a continuity of Hawaiian citizenship starts to come into play. So Hawaii Island is like how we had mentioned, it's the progenitor of the Hawaiian Kingdom, right? It's the seat of power, right? The Hawaiian Kingdom consolidates the Kingdom of Maui, right? The Hawaiian Kingdom consolidates Oahu, Niihau, Kauai into one, right? But before it did that, right? Kamehameha, as we all know, he has his history, his battles here. I think what's important to note about Kamehameha is if you consider, right, how large Hawaii Island is, right? All of the other islands can fit into this island, right? If you consider how large it is, right? Think about how difficult it is to consolidate a government under one rule, right? How do you get somebody to follow the laws who's living in Ka'u when your seat of power is in Kohala, right? What you end up having, essentially, right, is a very sophisticated system, right? A very sophisticated civilization. You have a defined territory, you have a defined population, a central government, right? And this is over, what is it, 1 million square miles of land here in Hawaii Island, right? It's a lot. What is also important to note, I think, with regard to Kamehameha and the rise of the Hawaiian Kingdom, is that there are only a few other places throughout the world that has a system of organization, a polity, right? A political organization like we have in Hawaii. There's not too many other places in the world in which you have these big systems at play, right? Most of the world at this time is very tribal. Hawaii is actually considered the 7th region in the world in which an idea of a primary state evolved. Now, what is a primary state? Today we understand countries as states today, right? We have the country of China, we have the country of the United States, we have Japan, Hawaii. All these states came from 7 different regions in the world. One of those regions is Hawaii. Hawaii is considered the last region in the world in which an advanced political system developed, right? Under one bureaucratic central government. What is also important, I think, and this is why I have Kanawai Ma'amaloha up here, is this act, many of you know, this is a battle that Kamehameha gets into with fishermen, and he almost loses his life. This is actually one of the first moments in our history in which we start to distinguish the king from the makainana, the king from the common, right? After Ma'amaloha, right, everybody's not a combatant, right? Women and children can go free by the wayside, right? But it's a separation. You start to see this separation from the king being the almighty king, right? And the encompasser of all subjects. So you start to see this differentiation, right, between the king and the citizen. I think also very important is, I think, Kamehameha's early diplomatic encounters. Many of us know, I think, a lot about Captain Cook. I would argue that we need to know a lot more about Vancouver. Yeah. Vancouver and Kamehameha, I think, engage in a relationship, engage in diplomatic relations that leads to what we have in 1843. Yeah. There is a moment in Keawe where there's an agreement that takes place between the British Crown, right? George Vancouver is negotiating on behalf of King George III of Great Britain. And this agreement leads to an interesting relationship, right? Kamehameha is interested in a relationship with Great Britain because of the protection it's going to afford, right? At this time, you have European imperialism, colonialism is running rapid in the Pacific, right? And there's an opportunity here for Kamehameha to make friends, right? To befriend the big bully in the world, right? And that's Great Britain. And he does this through relationship building with Vancouver. In Keawe in 1794, an agreement takes place which basically cedes the island of Hawaii to the British Crown. Now, historians have looked at this and said, oh, here's an example of colonialism, right? Here's an example of the brown man, the brown Hawaiian chief, being manipulated by the white man to give up his sovereignty, right? That's not the case. It's actually the opposite, right? Here's an example of Kamehameha, I would argue, manipulating one of the most powerful countries in the world, Great Britain, to become friends, to become a diplomatic, to engage in diplomatic agreements. Yeah? And one of the things that you hear, Kamehameha actually says, I am no longer Tanaka no Hawaii, right? You can see that as being a national of Hawaii. I am Tanaka no Britain. I am a citizen of Britain. And again, this is very important, right? This to me, I think, sets the stage for Hawaii to move into its independence. I think this sets the stage for Kūʻokoʻa, right? This is actually one of the earliest kinds of relationships that you see between Great Britain and other Pacific Island peoples in Hawaii. When we move into the constitutional era, particularly 1838, 1839, right? You have the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Rights. But what you also see, and I think what's particular to this presentation, is an entire section of the Hawaiian Constitution is dedicated to defining citizenship laws. There were basically three ways in which you could acquire Hawaiian citizenship through the constitutional system. Right? The first was by being born in the soil. Being born in the realm of the king, the Hawaiian kingdom, afforded you Hawaiian citizenship. The other way was through parentage. Right? If your parents were a subject or a citizen of the Hawaiian kingdom, then you also inherited that citizenship as well. And then the other maybe most progressive way at the time was through naturalization. You had foreigners from all over the globe finding their way to the shores of Hawaii, naturalizing and becoming Hawaiian. And this is done and afforded through by the Hawaiian Kingdom's Constitution. I think one of the important stories of citizenship in Hawaii is can be told through people like Anthony Allen. Anthony Allen is considered the first black man to come to Hawaii. He does so in the early 1800s. He's a former slave in the U.S. Right? Here we have a former slave in the United States, somebody who, for his entire life, was denied the rights and privileges of American citizenship. From the very onset of the American Constitution, right, till somewhere into like 1950, right, for almost 200 years, one of the main prerequisites to be an American citizen was what? Was white, right, and male, white male property owner. And in many ways, right, this debate over who can be an American citizen, who can be an American citizen today and who can't, is still very much alive in American politics, right? You turn on CNN and you turn on Fox News, and that is still a conversation that the United States still has today, right? They're still having difficulty figuring out that question of who can belong, who can be a part of their country, and who can't. Anthony Allen, he found a country that had very progressive laws for the time. Right? If you put it in context, or in contrast to the United States, the Hawaiian Kingdom is passing racially inclusive citizenship laws 20 years before the Civil War is ended and the abolishment of slavery in 1866. 1865. Right? The Hawaiian Kingdom is affording racially inclusive citizenship to people 120 years before the American Civil Rights Movement pops off. Right? We have people like Anthony Allen who are coming to Hawaii, following the law, naturalizing, and being afforded all the rights and privileges therein. Anthony Allen, I think this is a trivia question, he's actually the first owner, right, of a resort in Waikiki. Right? So not only is Anthony Allen being afforded access to citizenship and nationality and voting rights, but he's also having access to property rights. Again, this is a former slave who's coming from a system in which white supremacy, as an institution, is framing who is and who isn't a citizen. Yeah. Betsy Stockton is another example. She is also a former slave. She's considered the first black woman to be in Hawaii. She doesn't naturalize. However, she does take advantage of the social mobility that Hawaiian Kingdom law had offered. She becomes a school teacher, where she taught women and children in Hawaiian and English. She opens the Stockton Institute. The Stockton Institute later becomes Lahaina Una, one of the oldest public education systems or schools in Hawaii. So I think this story, right, of how former African American slaves, right, escaping the grips of slavery, finding their way to the shores of Hawaii, naturalizing, I think really speaks to how inclusive, right, how inclusive Hawaiians were when it came to this topic of citizenship. This is a journal, the Journal of Negro History. This is written by Mears Tate in the 1960s. Mears Tate was a scholar. She is, I believe, the first African American woman to teach at an Ivy League school. I think it's Cornell or Brown, one of them. Nonetheless, she spends a lot of her time devoted to researching Hawaii in the Pacific. And to have an African woman of color in the 1960s talk about Hawaii is special, right? Because for us, most of the literature that we were receiving in the 60s and 70s were written by white men at the University of Hawaii. Right? Gavin Dawes, Kaikino. This is interesting. Mears Tate provides a different lens on it. This particular article, she writes, called "Slavery and Racism as Deterrents to the Annexation of Hawaii." So there was discussions about Hawaii being annexed to the United States, and not in 1898, but in 1854, right, during Keawe's time. Primarily because of the gunboat diplomacy that's happening, right? The French are pointing guns at Hawaii at different times. Great Britain is pointing guns at Hawaii at different times. There becomes this possibility out there, right, that the Hawaiian government, she speculated and may have entertained, was ceding the islands to Hawaii as a mode of protection. One of the primary reasons why this doesn't happen, Mears Tate writes, is because Keawe came to a better understanding of how race and racism operated in America. Right? There was the prospect, right, that in the chance that Hawaii becomes a part of the United States, Keawe is noticing that geographically Hawaii falls beneath the color line. Right? And so there is a possibility if we become a part of the United States in 1854, we will be treated like the American Negro, right, and the American Indian. This to me is important because we have a government, right? Keawe is understanding how race relations is working in the United States, right? And in contrast, it also gives you an understanding of how race relations in Hawaii is working, and how very unique and distinct it is from America. I think outside of the African American example I just gave you, I think another very important ethnic group to point out in Hawaii's history is the Chinese. I would argue that there isn't another place in the world in the 19th century, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s, there's not another country in the world that's more accepting and receiving of Chinese. There is a long history of Chinese we know who were plantation workers, right, who came here to flee the oppression of their provinces, to come here and work in the fields. I think there's another story that could be told about the many Chinese who walked out of the fields, walked out of their contract labor, and became very successful entrepreneurs in the Hawaiian Kingdom, right? And in part, they were afforded to do this, again, because of how inclusive Hawaiian citizenship laws were, right? Outside of Caucasians Chinese are naturalizing at the most highest rates throughout the 19th century. And so, when 1887 comes around, right, so we enjoy almost 50 years of an evolution of a constitution in which our citizenship rights continue, right? The inclusive nature of Hawaiian citizenship lasts basically all the way up until 1887. And then what happens in 1887? Bayonet Constitution, right? One of the most detrimental articles, right, within the Bayonet Constitution is in regards to citizenship. For the first time in the Hawaiian Kingdom, and mind you, this is also how we know it's a Bayonet Constitution and an evolution, is because they open up the franchise, right? They offer voting to foreigners. Now, for the first time in 1887, Hawaiians, Americans, and Europeans are offered the franchise. 1887. Asians are completely ignored and excluded from the Constitution. They're essentially written out of the Hawaiian Constitution. And so you can imagine, and this is what some of the newspaper articles up here are pointing to, right? Is that when 1887 comes around, you have an ethnic population, right? Chinese ethnic population, who has just been stripped of everything. They've just been stripped of citizenship. And mind you, right, those that are behind the Bayonet Constitution, those that are drafting the Constitution, right, they're creating a system which is going to mirror the United States, right? At this time, right, the United States itself has anti-Asian laws. It has anti-Chinese, right, anti-Asian sentiment. You have in 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act is preventing Chinese from coming into the United States. Right? 1887 starts to mirror some of that. But as you can imagine, right, Chinese start to organize. When 1887 comes around, when 1893 comes around, and 1898 comes around, it's not just one ethnic group under the banner of Hawaiian nationality that's fighting that. Right? You have ethnic Chinese standing shoulder to shoulder with ethnic OEV, right? Shoulder to shoulder with Caucasians who are fighting for their country as well, right? The idea that it was just the Aboriginal population who was fighting for this place and for their national identity is not right? It's incorrect. You actually have many who even took up violent means, right? They fired back at the Republic, right? They fired back at those that were stripping of their rights. So I think it's very important to remember that when these illegalities took place, it wasn't just one ethnic group standing next to the Queen, right? It was a multitude. In many ways, it might have looked like this room today. Yeah.
Different clothes.
so quick comment here. One of the greatest evidence, right, of that reveals how large the resistance was and how multi-ethnic it was is the Kūʻokoʻa petitions, right? The Kūʻokoʻa petitions are not just signed by Hawaii's Aboriginal population, right, but by all Hawaiian nationals and even foreigners as well too. So again, this is just more what was interesting in and around the 1880s. Kalakaua had requested that a racial taxonomist be sent from Sweden, come to Hawaii and figure out what is this about race, right? What is the racial class? What is race? And what is it doing for us? What is it not doing for us? He sends for a racial taxonomist. He comes from Sweden to figure out where do Hawaiians fit within this category called race. And this is an article written by Virginia Dominguez, who never comes to a real understanding of what made him request for a racial taxonomist to come. One of the speculations is that in this looming prospect, right, in the 1880s, where Kalakaua is having to entertain the possibility of being absorbed by the United States, he wants to have a better understanding of where Hawaiians are going to fit within the social hierarchy of America, right? Similar to what his predecessor did, Keawe, trying to get an understanding of how American racial politics is working, right? And again, at the same time, they're realizing that American racial politics is defined by white supremacy, right? That's what defines American citizenship in the 19th century. Right? So again, further evidence, right, for Kalakaua and the government to say, no, right? Annexation would be detrimental in many ways. One of them would be to where we fall within the social hierarchy of America, right? There's many of articles written in and around this time that talk about the idea of Hawaiians being treated like the American Negro, right? Hawaiians being treated like the Native American, right? And that's not something that you want to jump into. Yeah. Even the Queen as well too.
Get no signal.
So the Queen also has similar sentiments. She says, and yet this great and powerful nation must go across 2,000 miles of sea and take from the poor Hawaiians their little spots in the broad Pacific. Must covet our islands of Hawaii and extinguish the nationality of my poor people, many of whom have not a foot of land which can be called their own. And for what? In order that another race problem shall be injected into the social and political perplexities in which the United States, in the great experiment of popular government, is already struggling, in order that a novel and inconsistent foreign and colonial policy shall be grafted upon, up until now, an impregnable diplomacy, or in order that a friendly and generous yet proud-spirited and sensitive race, a race admittedly capable and worthy of receiving the best opportunities for material and moral progress, shall be crushed under the weight of a social order and prejudice with which even another country of preparation would hardly fit to cope. Right? So again, even the Queen, she's also reflecting upon the dynamics of race in the United States, right? And she's seeing, almost forecasting, right? What the future of Hawaiians will be, right? Especially where they will fit within that racial hierarchy. This is a newspaper article that's, this is in the San Francisco Call. this is a whole swath of different newspapers throughout America that are commenting, that have input, right, on this question of annexation. And in many of these newspaper accounts, one of the overriding reasonings, right, or logic behind why annexation shouldn't happen is because of the law, right? Most of these news reporters, right, are saying that via international law or even via U.S. constitutional law, there is absolutely no way in which Hawaii could become a part of the United States, right? And this is right, and these are newspapers: San Diego, Philadelphia, Boston, Indianapolis, Omaha, Pittsburgh, Harper's Weekly, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Sacramento, right? Throughout the United States, there is an overwhelming understanding that that what's about to be done to Hawaii cannot happen legally. The other overwhelming, I think, sentiment around annexation again has to do with race. A lot of white Americans, particularly the Southern Democrats at the time, are very concerned about the idea of Americanizing, right, in their word, the hordes of Asians, the half-castes in Hawaii, the ignorant Portuguese, right? These were right. You had white Southern Democrats who didn't want the United States to annex Hawaii, not because they didn't think it was legal, but because they were looking for racial parity. The idea of extending America's borders into the Pacific and into a place in which you had a multi-ethnic population would damage the parity that they were looking for in regard to American citizenship. Right? So one of the reasons why Hawaii is not, one of the reasons why some people didn't want to be a part of Hawaii is because of the possibility of Americanizing, right, half-caste Portuguese people who are excluded from the franchise in the United States. Yeah, this is kind of getting to that as well too, right? Fit for annexation, but unfit to vote. Yeah, that was kind of the quandary. That was the quandary that Americans were in at the time, right? American government was had to navigate around. This is a newspaper clipping from 1900, where you have one of the senators, right, of Missouri, who says, "Whenever I'm faced," and this is the question that they're trying to figure out again, right? And this is commentary by one of those Southern Democrats. "Whenever I'm faced with the race problem," continued Williams, "I stand for white supremacy. I stand for white supremacy in Hawaii as I stand for it in Mississippi. It is the duty of man to lift up those below him if he can, but there is no injunction, human or divine, which obliges white men to herd with narrow foreheads, ignorant of our glorious deeds. I have no idea that the blacks will ever rise to the place of the whites, and I indulge in no hypocrisy about it." Right, so this to me is a snapshot of where we're headed. Right? This is 1900, this is the territorial era in which for the first time Hawaii is no longer governed by its people and for its people. But instead we have senators, right, almost 5,000 miles away, who are commenting on the future of Hawaii, right? Many of them go so far as to say, why not just institutionalize white supremacy in Hawaii? And you could definitely argue that that's what happens. One of the things that you start to see in this evolution and history of citizenship is that at one point in the 19th century, Hawaiian Kingdom law, right, actually provided protection, right, not just for the Aboriginal population, but for all people of color, right? It provided an umbrella. Hawaiian citizenship provided an umbrella which allowed for protection. And in many ways, you could say, right, even though we had Christianity, right, even though we had this influx of disease, even though we had white people in powerful places in Hawaii. I would argue, right, and with an analysis of citizenship, that white supremacy as an institution, as a structure, never existed in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Hawaiian Kingdom law always prevented white supremacy from getting out of control, if you will. Right? Citizenship laws help to regulate not just the behaviors of its citizens, but foreigners who came into Hawaii. This, however, is a statement that reflects where Hawaii is headed. Right? With the elimination of Hawaiian Kingdom law, the ouster of Hawaiian legislators, right? The ouster of the Queen, the overthrow, right? What ends up happening is that almost the entire public infrastructure of Hawaii, the administrative infrastructure of Hawaii is taken over, right? And in almost 99% of the cases, each of the departments that we have in Hawaii, from public education to healthcare, you name it, is run by a white administrator, a white American administrator. And that also includes the Department of Education as well. Right? There's another newspaper article that I included with regard to women's suffrage. Right? There's still a question about women voting in the 19th century. There isn't. I have yet to see any evidence that suggests that women were voting in the 19th century. There isn't any law, right, within any of Hawaiian Kingdom law that actually prevents them from doing it. However, women are not voting in the 19th century. And I want to be clear that doesn't mean that women didn't have access to political power. Right? Women throughout the 19th century, I think there's a number of cases, there's many examples in which women were asserting political power in a country and in a time where very little other countries, right, were affording women with that kind of power. Yeah. And then when you even look into some of the most crucial and pivotal times of Hawaii, namely 1897, 1898, it's the women, right, that are organizing, right? Hui Kalai Aina, Aloha Aina, right? The women's patriotically, they're going island to island, and they're speaking to crowds that look just like this. Ku'aihelani Campbell, Aimanawahi are two, I think, great examples who are giving. Right, so Aimanawahi, and this is an article that was written by Muriel Michelson. Muriel Michelson was a reporter for the San Francisco Call. She was in Hilo actually in 1897. And she witnessed Ku'aihelani Campbell and Aimanawahi give a political speech, right? An anti-annexation speech at Salvation Army. And one of the things that Muriel Michelson, who was a woman, an American journalist at the time, what she notes is how shocked she was, right? To see two eloquent, articulate Native Hawaiian women on a political platform talking about something this impactful such as annexation, right, to a crowd in which there were men. Muriel Michelson was a little taken back that women were actually given the platform, right, and to educate and to give political speeches when men were in the audience. Nonetheless, I think there was this conversation here about in 1894, right? So for a year after the overthrow takes place, the provisional government and the republic start to ask this question, entertain the idea: should we allow women to vote? And what do you think the response was? No. The response was no, because Kanaka women were too intellectual, they're too smart. They're going to show up to the voting block. They didn't want that. Kanaka women outnumbered Haole women 7-1 at the time, right? And so the idea of giving them the franchise would disrupt all of their intentions to take the government over.
But you know what is so hard to understand? Why Queen Elizabeth could run her country, or why they had to prison our queen when she was running our country. She was a very polar queen. Everybody had respect for her because she was polar queen. No matter what color, race, where you come from, you had rights in Hawaii, just like everybody else.
Agreed.
I can't understand that.
But it was just a comment about how righteous the queen was and how important of a leader she was. The queen was definitely all those things, and I think she was a scholar in intellect, and she knew. I think one of the places where we could bring emphasis to her name is the amount that she knew with regard to Hawaiian Kingdom law, U.S. constitutional law, and international law at the time. Right? She plays her cards perfectly, right? And she's the reason why we have a bulletproof legal argument today. I was interviewed by Dinesh D'Souza, who is an ultra right-wing Republican who made a film in 2016 that was basically aimed at stopping Barack Obama's re-election. Yeah, re-election. And their idea was to travel to the different places in which Barack Obama had been, to get a better understanding of who he was, right? To show him in a negative light. At the time, myself and Dr. Sai, we had just finished a presentation called "Why the Birthers Are Right for All the Wrong Reasons." In 2012, we gave a presentation in the political science department. Why the birthers are right for all the wrong reasons. Who are the birthers?
Donald Trump's.
The birthers are basically Donald Trump, right? And his faction that continue to rail against Obama in saying that, right, that Barack Obama cannot be the president of the United States because he was born in Kenya. So the birthers are right, not because Barack Obama was born in Kenya, right, but because he was born in an occupied state. Barack Obama was born in 1961 in Hawaii, Kapiolani Hospital, right, in an occupied country. Let me get into this. So one of the excerpts from the book, right, says, at the University of Hawaii, I also interviewed Willie Keawe, a graduate student who recently gave a talk on why the birthers are right for all the wrong reasons. Keawe's argument is very interesting. He says that, of course, Barack Obama was born in Hawaii, but he is still ineligible to be president. That's because the U.S. Constitution specifies not only that the president must be a U.S. citizen, but also that the president must be natural born. The president, in other words, must be born in the United States. But Keawe's argument is that Hawaii is not legally part of the United States because U.S. forces illegally annexed Hawaii in the late 19th century. So from Keawe's point of view, the birthers are right, not because Obama was born in Kenya, because Hawaii, where Obama was born, is actually a foreign country. I asked if this would amount to Hawaii seceding from the United States. He said no. Seceding would imply that Hawaii was ever a part of the United States. And so this right there, I think, takes us into this question, right? If we're starting to poke holes in Barack Obama, right, and his presidency, then what does that say for the rest of us, right? How do we then begin to figure out who comprises the Hawaiian national population today?
I think we as our kingdom, we as a nation, or our own country, should be able to make that decision for ourselves.
I would argue that the decision is already made for us, that our ancestors have already provided the definition for what and who can we consider to be a Hawaiian national today, right? When we break it down today, there are probably 630,000 Hawaiian citizens in the world today, right? How do I get that? I get that by using census reports, right? But tracing, if you're able to trace your nationality back to somebody who was a Hawaiian national, right? Pre-1898, pre-1893, let's get a little technical, we won't go into that. You would be considered a Hawaiian national today. So, when we break that down, we're talking about the whole entire Aboriginal population in the world, right? Which is about 600,000. There's 600,000 Kanaka in the world, Aboriginal, that have kōkua in blood. The problem with that number is almost half are not living here, right? Half have become a part of the diaspora, right? They ironically live in the country of the occupier. And most of us, of course, have family, and there are many reasons why Hawaiians get pushed out of Hawaii. And the occupation has everything and anything to do with it. So 630,000 Hawaiian nationals today, right? The population in Hawaii is about 1.5 million, right? So we're also having to within this question, we're also dealing with somewhere close to about 1 million people living in Hawaii who would be considered aliens. What do you do with that population, right? If we turn to international law doesn't allow us to just kick people out, right? It doesn't allow us to discriminate based on religion, nationality, right? Ethnic origin. But nonetheless, right, there is a population of about 1 million aliens that currently resides in Hawaii. I think classifying that and categorizing that, acknowledging that first they are aliens is very important in this question. One of the things that in a post-occupied state, one of the first things that I think we would have to do is have a Nationality Act, right? There would need to be a census to have a better understanding of who is living in Hawaii, right? The different nationalities that are here besides Hawaiian. Some of the things that included is incentives for how do we start to repatriate? How do we start to get our diasporic Hawaiians back to Hawaii? One of the things I had mentioned earlier, right, at Native Hawaiian Student Services, what we're doing at the University of Hawaii Manoa is we're trying to make the University of Hawaii, which historically has not welcomed Hawaiians as much as it should be. Currently, the Hawaiian population at UH Manoa comprises about 15%. That equates to about 2,700 students in a population of about 18,000. So we're about 14 and 15% of the student population. We're 5% of the faculty on campus, and we're less than 1% in administration. And mind you, right, 15% students, 5% faculty, 1% administration at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. The school's been open for almost 110 years. And if you look at where we're at right now, just that statistics alone, you can see the kind of structural barriers that have prevented us from entering this Research One institution, right? Where a lot of this work, all of this work, right, was being done. I'm happy to say that, one of the things that we did to start to, I think, reinvigorate the 19th century, reinvigorate the Hawaiian Kingdom on the University of Hawaii campus, is that my colleague, Nalani Belutsky, had created, as part of her PhD dissertation work, was looking into a very progressive educational program that took place in the 1880s. Right? It was called Kalakaʻa's Hawaiian Youths Abroad program, where he basically sent upwards to 19 students around the world to get educated and trained in different disciplines and come back and serve the Lahui. In 2018, this past summer, the Pharmaceutical Services reinstituted Kalakaʻa's program. It was 120 years later. We took 13 students around the world. We went to London, we went to Paris, to look at our ancestors and their paths. Right? And I think what's so amazing about that particular trip is that in every single city we went to, in every single library we went to, in every single repository that we went to, there was a trace, there was a trail that we were there. Right? These are some of the students. Booth and Boyd and Wilcox in Italy, Harbottle went to Japan, Kapa'a went to China, Kapena, Scotland, Pavelo, Scotland, Lovell, Scotland, Kamau Oha went to England, Matthew Makalua was considered the first Western-trained medical doctor. He trained in England. We actually went to his gravesite while we were there. Abraham Pi'anaya trained in England, Thomas Spencer, United States, Thomas Cummings, United States, David Kwananakoa, United States, August Herring, Italy, Marchand, United States, and Maile Naulen, the only Wahine, she was in Italy. This is a video that was composed by one of our students that documented this trip. And this video is not going to work. I don't think we have enough.
Oh, here we go. You get any sound?
You know what, I don't think this is going to work. But yeah, mahalo nui, thank you. Sorry, one more thing. So one of the things that we're also coming to realize as well too, right, is how influential we were in setting up the public infrastructure of this place, right? If you look at all of the public infrastructure that we have, from the county systems, hospital system, healthcare, education, the whole entire private school system, right? All of these institutions were created in the 19th century. These are not American inventions, right? Queen's Hospital is not an American invention. Right? It's one they later took over, but definitely not an American invention. The Department of Education as well too, right? Iolani, St. Louis, these premier high schools as well too. One of the things I think is very important is we can add the University of Hawaii to that list. A while back, the university was asked to put out a history of itself, essentially. And the university had placed the locus of its genealogy to the Republic of Hawaii, who they said signed into law on January 4th, 1893, an act that would later create the Bureau of Agriculture. Now what's wrong with that statement? On January 4th, 1893, the Republic of Hawaii signed an act that created the Bureau of Agriculture that later became the University of Hawaii. Right? The problem with that is that the Republic of Hawaii doesn't exist on January 4th, 1893. It's still, your Hawaiian legislature is still, just came out of session, the 1892 legislature just came out of session. And within that legislative session, the Queen signs on January 4th, 1893, a bill that creates the Bureau of Department and the Interior, the Bureau of Agriculture and Forestry. This Bureau of Agriculture and Forestry later becomes CTAR, College of Tropical Ag, Human Resources on the University of Hawaii campus, which later becomes the University of Hawaii. Right? So again, we have another institution here, which again also belongs to us as well. Right? This is an institution that we created, and I'm happy to say that this is an institution that we're starting to be a lot more significant in today, have a lot more impact today as well too. Right? And the idea of the Queen being one of the progenitors of the University of Hawaii is one of the greatest recruitment tools and one of the greatest recruitment tools that we have for our appeal looking to come to the University of Hawaii. So I will end with that. Mahalo. Thank you.
Again, I am just very, very excited and happy to see all of you here. As you're learning more and more, information. One of the things growing up, we just never had this kind of information for all of us. And to see all of you out here today, I'm getting comments from other people. They said, "Oh, this is really good." So we need to continue to spread this information and share the information. The other thing that I'd like all of you to know is that this is not with our volunteers that we have for ʻAha Kānaka Moku Keawe. This is not a recruitment to join our group. This is just education so that you can take the education and then decide what you want to do with it. Okay? So we're not trying to recruit anybody or build another sovereignty group or whatever. And this is a foundation that we have for ʻAha Kānaka Moku Keawe. Okay. The other thing that we have is that how many of you have taken the time to go to the county council and give testimony before the county council on different issues? Raise your hand. Okay, we have a few of you that have done it. For those of you who haven't done it, especially if you're not familiar with public speaking, it can be really intimidating. So a lot of the people just don't want to do it. And so this is one of the things that we have to be careful of here. Especially as Hawaiian Kingdom subjects, when we go and give testimony before the county council, because when we do that, what's taking place is that we're recognizing the county council's authority when you go do that. And so we don't want that to take place. And so the last few times that we went to go give testimony, we put the county council on notice and told them that we're protected persons and subjects of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And secondly, we also notified them to tell them that they are creating bills and resolutions in violation of international law. And so the county council members, when they were hearing all of this stuff, especially the Hawaiians on the county council, you should have seen their faces drop from smile to because we were now calling them out. And one of the persons that I have so much aloha for, but I stood on the sidelines, and this small little holy girl, especially when she was elected, I didn't know who she was. She was elected, I'm like, oh, this small little holy girl, They could put her through the ringer. It was just the opposite. Should put all the other county council members through the ringer. And what's more interesting is that what planted the seed for her to do that was when she attended our conference last year at the Hilo Boys and Girls Club. It was over a year ago when she came and she heard the speakers that you're hearing today. That planted a seed and she started to ask questions. So she left, and after she left, I went, okay, there's a county council member, yeah, okay. You know, never heard from her for the whole year. Until finally, she reached out to Dr. Syed to ask questions, and she got a copy of the letter, or actually the memo, from Dr. Desires from the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights. And that's when everything started to accelerate. And I tell you, for a little Hawaii girl, she got big balls. She got some of the biggest balls that I've seen because she's standing up, knowing that there was going to be massive criticism from her own people in her own district, accusing her of just collecting a paycheck. She did her homework. And I invite all of you to go do your homework also. I'd like to introduce my hero, Councilwoman Jen Rhodes.
Thank you. Wow. Well, thank you all for being here once again to educate yourself, because that is the most important thing. And that's pretty much, that's where I started as well. It's pretty funny how things can come full circle, huh? It was actually 2 years ago that I went to the conference, and it took me a whole year of kind of doing this grueling research and going through Dr. Sai's papers and going through the resources and verifying it, because it just blew my mind and it made me want to jump out of my skin as a legislator for the United States. So just to give you some history, I was actually born and raised here, and I had heard rumors that Hawaii was occupied. I did my best to respect the culture and understand it, but I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how Hawaii was occupied. I'd heard that there was a vote and that the people voted to become a part of the United States, and so it's now the 50th state, and I was taught that we were that 50th star in the flag. And I had to pledge allegiance to the United States every morning. So when I came to this conference and I saw all the presentations, one of the presentations that struck me the most was Dr. Keawe Sai's, because it was very confusing. And so I introduced myself to him afterwards, and he recommended that I read a couple of his publications, and it took me a really long time to get through them, like 20 minutes a page, looking up legal words that I didn't understand. And eventually I had a lot of questions, so I asked him if he would meet, and he accommodated and laid it all out for me. And then from there, I realized that it became a question to me whether or not I was committing war crimes as a legislator. And so I want to explain to you how that works and then what my roles would be.
Sweetie, is Kamehameha here?
No.
How come?
I don't think Kamehameha.
That's my family.
So Joe Kamehameha is
Joe is my
Corporation
family.
Counsel. We're going to talk about him in a minute.
Joe! It's a big family, the Kamehameha.
So what I want to explain to you is what it means to be an agent of the United States within the Hawaiian Kingdom. So as an agent of the occupier, what our role is within an occupied country. And I believe that's the most important message that I have for you here. So During this time of research, I received an email from the Acting Council of Regency. And within the email, there were several legal actions. And some of the most notable, which Keawe mentioned, was this memorandum from the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. This was sent in February of this year to all Hawaii state judges. And who wrote it was Dr. Alfred Desaias, and he's actually an American. He graduated from Harvard University. And the US sat on this council when he was appointed, or when he was elected, and they didn't dispute his election. And so this is what he says. He says that I've come to understand that the lawful political status of the Hawaiian Islands is that of a sovereign nation state in continuity. So he says it's a sovereign nation state in continuity. So what does that mean? That means a country. America is a sovereign nation state in continuity along with Canada and France, Japan, and the Hawaiian Kingdom. They all have the same rights and responsibilities. And he says, under a strange form of occupation by the United States resulting from the illegal military occupation and a fraudulent annexation. So when we think of occupation, what do we think of? We think of war. We think of Syria and Iraq. And that's probably why he says that this is a strange form of occupation. And then fraudulent annexation. I think we all know what fraud means. And we're going to get into annexation in a little while. He goes on to say, as such, international laws, the Hague and Geneva Conventions, require that the governance and legal matters within the occupied territory of the Hawaiian Islands must be administered by the application of the laws of the occupied state, in this case the Hawaiian Kingdom, not the laws of the occupier, the United States. So this means that we should be administering we should be administering Hawaiian Kingdom law. We should be following Hawaiian Kingdom law, not United States law. Again, this was sent to all of the circuit court judges this past February.
Are the judges using it? That's the question.
We haven't heard anything back. My attorney did confirm that they received it and they have taken no action, which is shameful. And also, I searched further to verify the claims that the Hawaiian Kingdom existed, and this is another good piece of evidence that was in that email I received. And this is a case called Larson versus the Hawaiian Kingdom at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. This is an international court. Let me zoom in for you. They accepted this case between Lance Larson and the Hawaiian Kingdom, and in order for them to have accepted it, they had to have jurisdiction over it, which meant it had to be an international matter. And when the case was first filed with them, they said this is a domestic dispute within the United States because Hawaii is the 50th state of the United States, and so we can't. This isn't a part of our jurisdiction. This isn't an international matter. But after an exchange between notes with all the parties, they did accept it, and they accepted it between a private party and a state, which internationally means a country, a sovereign, independent country, just like France and just like the United States. And the status of this case is ongoing. And Dr. Sai will be speaking around 5, and I'm sure he can update you on the progress. And so, in my pursuit to really understand what this meant, I had to understand that there's a difference between a state and its government. A difference between its country and a government. So say if Canada was overthrown tomorrow, or if their government was overthrown, they would still exist as a country. The same with Iraq. When their government was overthrown, they still existed, and that's the same thing that's happening in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And that's how it can still exist. So that's kind of what helped me make sense of everything. Okay, so what happened? As a lot of us know, on January 16th, 1893, 160 U.S. Marines landed with the intention of overthrowing the government, which they did the following day. And the National Teachers Association just published an article on this. Actually, a couple of articles. The National Teachers Association is America's largest labor union, with over 3 million members, which is pretty amazing. And the HSTA is our local chapter. So what does this mean? When the government was overthrown. So there's two states of affairs that a country can be in: a state of peace or a state of war. So a few months later, President Cleveland conducted an investigation, and then he made a report on his findings to Congress on December 18th. And he said that the military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was itself an act of war. An act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States without the authority of Congress. The government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. A substantial wrong has been done. So here President Cleveland declared that the United States had committed an act of war against the Hawaiian Kingdom. So that means that now the state of affairs goes from a state of peace to a state of war. And when the state of affairs are in a state of war, that means that the laws of war apply. And those would be the laws of occupation, which is where my role comes in. And then it also means that the state of war continues until the occupant either completely withdraws or a treaty of peace is reached that transfers the sovereignty of the occupied state to the occupier. So neither of those has happened since. So on January 17th, the day after the overthrow, the Queen wrote a letter of protest in which she yielded her authority to the United States government. Yield means to temporarily give way to. It doesn't mean to cede sovereignty. And so when she did that, she placed the Hawaiian Kingdom under the authority of a hostile army. So from that point on, the Hawaiian Kingdom was now occupied. Does that make sense? So in order for a territory to be considered occupied, it has to be placed under the authority of a hostile army. So when she yielded her authority to the United States, it was placed under the authority of a hostile army. Later, on July 4th, 1894, the insurgency renamed themselves to the Republic of Hawaii. And then in 1900, the United States Congress renamed the Republic to a territory of Hawaii. And then in 1959, later, the state of Hawaii. And then in 1900, they began the process of denationalization. I'm not going to get into it here because it's going to be talked about later, but I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of the term denationalization? Wow, that's good. That's a good amount. It's a lot more than I would expect. I didn't know about that. It blew me away. Yeah. So now let's talk about what the human rights expert referred to as the fraudulent annexation. So when we talk about annexation, we have to talk about cession and treaties. So the only form in which annexation can happen is in an agreement embodied in a treaty between the ceding and acquiring state. So a country cedes its sovereignty through a treaty of peace, and then the accepting country accepts it, and it becomes therefore annexed. So you have to have cession in order for there to be annexation, and that cession only happens through a treaty of peace. There is no treaty of peace between the United States and the Hawaiian Kingdom that cedes the Hawaiian Kingdom's sovereignty to the United States.
Thank you. Sorry.
So in 1898, Congress passed a resolution, a joint resolution annexing the Hawaiian Islands. So there's a glaring problem here. Besides there actually being no treaty, as a legislator, there's a glaring problem here. That is, as a legislator, I know that our county only has authority over our county, which means I can't pass laws for Maui, just as much as the United States can't pass laws for Canada. So I can't pass a law of a resolution, because we do pass resolutions all the time. In fact, I've introduced multiple resolutions. This would be as if I introduced a resolution to rename Maui to Hawaii County, and now we get all their taxes and they have to follow our laws. We know that's not legally possible. Same goes for the United States. The United States can't pass laws for Canada just as much as it can't pass laws for Hawaii, for the Hawaiian Kingdom. Legislation within one independent state or territory does not have an effect beyond its own borders. So when people tell you that Hawaii was annexed by resolution and that that's somehow a legal way to acquire sovereignty, ask them, then how come the United States doesn't just pass a resolution annexing the entire world? Because using that logic, they could just annex every single country through a joint resolution. We know that's not legally possible. And the same goes for the Hawaiian Kingdom.
So how do we correct that wrong?
Excuse me?
How do we correct that wrong?
Well, let me get into it. And let me just get through the presentation here. So now we've established that there's no legal evidence that Hawaii was ever made a part of the United States. So what does that mean for someone in my position? So like I said, there's two states of affairs a country can be in. We're now in a state of war, so the laws of occupation apply. And that these laws of occupation are outlined in international treaties. And these treaties are called the Hague and Geneva Conventions. How many of you have heard of the Hague and Geneva Conventions? Right on.
Yeah, I do.
So let's see what they say. So the Hague and Geneva Conventions are U.S. ratified treaties. And they're actually codified under United States Code. This is federal law. And the definition of a war crime, section 2441, specifies that a war crime is any breach to any of these international conventions. So if we break any convention, we are committing a war crime according to United States law. And this is what these conventions say. The penal laws of the occupied territory shall remain in force. This is exactly what the UN human rights experts said, that we should be administering Hawaiian Kingdom law. They also say the Hague Convention, Article 43, says the authority of the legitimate power having in fact passed into the hands of the occupant, the latter shall take all measures in his power to restore and ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety while respecting the laws in force in the country. So how does this relate to me as my capacity as a legislator? Well, let's talk about my oath. This is my oath of office. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and I will take this obligation freely without mental reservation or purpose of evasion, that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of this office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. This is where my oath comes from. This is Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. All treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. All senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of several state legislatures shall be bound by oath to support this Constitution. So the Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. The Hague and Geneva Conventions are U.S. signed treaties. So nowhere within my oath does it say I must vote on legislation. It does say that I'm bound to uphold these internationally signed treaties. And again, any violation of these treaties are war crimes in U.S. law. So within my research, it became a question to me if I may be committing war crimes for legislating United States law and not Hawaiian Kingdom law, like the laws of occupation specify. So I decided to consult with my county attorney, who this gentleman mentioned, Mr. Kamehameha. He's also known as Corporation Counsel. That's his official legal position. So this is what we asked him. So I hired an attorney to help me draft the question. We sent him 9 pages of facts that I was concerned about, along with almost 400 pages of attachments. And I asked him, we wanted him to assure me that I'm not incurring criminal liability for participating in legislation of the Hawaii County Council that would appear to be in violation of the Hague and Geneva Convention, the articles that I just displayed for you here. I also wanted to know if I was committing war crimes by being complicit in the collection of taxes from protected persons, foreclosures, and prosecutions. And as you can see, we were very specific with the articles of the Hague and Geneva Conventions that we were concerned about, that these things appear to be in violation of. So let's see what he said. This is what he said. The next day, it was in fact the next morning, I don't even think he read the letter honestly. He said, in response to your inquiry, we opine that you will not incur any criminal liability under state, federal, and international law. See Article 6, Constitution of the United States, international law cannot violate federal law. So, first of all, we requested that he assure me, and the legal definition of assure means to put certain beyond all doubt. Does he put certain beyond all doubt? It's a conclusionary statement unsupported by any facts or evidence. And furthermore, let's look at Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. That's what he says to do. This is where my oath comes from. This is the exact clause that I was concerned about. It says, treaties are the supreme law of the land, and I am bound to them. Nowhere within it does it say international law cannot violate federal law. It's just not in there. And my attorney says that's not true. Sorry, I gotta stick to my notes here just so I'm not rambling about random stuff. So how many of you have heard of the torture memos? That's on you. Great, well, 2 people, that's pretty good. So in 2002, the Department of Defense inquired to the Department of Justice, which is the Corporation Council on the federal level. They inquired on whether or not torture was violating international treaties, because torture is illegal in the Hague and Geneva Conventions, and these were U.S. ratified, and they were concerned about Title 18 on war crimes, which is the section that I just displayed for you here. And John Yoo said he issued an opinion called The Application of Treaties and Laws to Al-Qaeda and Taliban Detainees, and he said that international law cannot conflict with federal law. And he said that the international treaties did not apply. Later, his opinion was found to be wrong, and now him and all of the American servicemen that were involved cannot travel to Europe or any of the countries that supported the development of the International Criminal Court, because they will be prosecuted for war crimes. And there's no statute of limitation on war crimes. So, yeah, it's concerning. So this is a legitimate question that I believe deserved a legitimate answer. And most importantly, he doesn't dispute that Hawaii is illegally occupied. He also doesn't dispute the commission of war crimes against protected persons, which is what I outlined in my letter as far as my concern. So he put me in the position of being a whistleblower. I did my due diligence, I researched, I asked questions, and he didn't dispute that Hawaii is actually legally occupied. So what does this mean for my job? Well, that means that now I have come to understand that Hawaii is in fact illegally occupied, and that as an agent of the United States, I have a special duty, and this is how. This is Article 29 of the Geneva Convention. It says a party to the conflict in whose hands protected persons may be is responsible for the treatment accorded to them by its agents, irrespective of any individual responsibility which may be incurred. The term agent must be understood as embracing everyone who is in service of the contracting party. So the contracting party would be the United States, because they signed the contract. The Hague and Geneva Conventions are contracts. And they include civil servants, judges, members of the armed forces, members of paramilitary police organizations, etc. So I'm a civil servant. And these agents must go through the greatest pains to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances. And so that is what I'm doing. I started with putting the CEO of Queen's Hospital on notice. This is my first letter that I sent out on September 20th. It was sent to Mr. Art Ishijima regarding war crimes committed against Aboriginal Hawaiians by Queen's Health Systems. So it turns out Queen's Hospital was set up by Queen Emma to provide free health care for Aboriginal Hawaiians. It was the first government subsidized health care in the world.
Right? We had a smart queen.
Right?
Right?
And Article 51 of the Geneva Convention specifies that the occupying power cannot abrogate or do away with the rights and safeguards afforded to protected persons, especially for children's medical care. So war crimes include acts of commission as well as acts of omission. And in this case, the war crime of omission and abrogation to Queen's Hospital's free health care to Aboriginal Hawaiians as protected persons, as mandated in their charter before the occupation, is a violation of Article 47 and 51 of the Geneva Convention, and therefore would constitute a war crime. So I say, in your capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of the Queen's Hospital, I call upon you and the Board of Trustees to comply with the 1859 Charter and to admit Aboriginal Hawaiians, as the term was understood under Kingdom law, for medical care free of charge. Failure to do so would constitute war crimes under Article 47 and 51 of the Geneva Convention. This letter serves as your knowledge and awareness of the factual circumstances that establish the existence of the armed conflict between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States. So I did receive a response. 4 days later, they said that they received the letter and they forwarded it to their staff for review. The issues I have raised are quite complex. And after they review it, they will follow up. I haven't heard anything since, but I will keep you posted if I do.
But they say as long as we have our Queen's will stating that we are to be taken care of at the hospital, all we have to do is show our paperwork from our Queen stating that the hospital does belong to the Hawaiian people, no matter what. Right?
Right. Okay, so next is Hawaii State judges. So I sent this on September 23rd to every circuit court judge in Hawaii. There's 30 of them, regarding war crimes committed against protected persons by state of Hawaii courts. So I explained that how it appears there's evidence that there are war crimes being committed and that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. I talk about how protected persons not only include Hawaiian Kingdom subjects, foreigners, but also United States citizens. I explained my oath of office and my recent question to Corporation Counsel and how I came out as a whistleblower and how my oath of office obligates me to put them on notice. So this is this is one of the paragraphs, this is the same paragraph that I showed you before, the UN Human Rights Memorandum. It says that the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom need to be being administered, not the laws of the United States. So let's see what the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom actually say regarding land titles. It must be acknowledged by a party or parties executing the same before the Registrar of Conveyances, or his agent, or some judge of court of record or notary public of this kingdom. It also specifies that if it's not in compliance with that, it is not entitled to be recorded in the Registry of Public Conveyances. So what does this mean? It means that because deeds of conveyances of real estate were not properly registered according to Hawaiian Kingdom law, that they cannot be considered lawfully executed. This is because all of, excuse me, let me just stick to my notes here. Because the people facilitating the deeds were not officers of the Hawaiian Kingdom, they were rather officers of the illegal insurgency, that means that all of the deeds of mortgages cannot be considered lawfully executed and to present are null and void. But that also means that if you have a mortgage, title insurance should cover it. And here's how. So a mortgage, what is a mortgage? A mortgage is something that you put up as collateral when you take out a loan. So it's a lien, which is a right to keep your property until your debt is paid off. So this is the process of escrow. So say you're going to borrow money to buy a house. The bank is going to give you a loan contract, and in exchange for that loan contract, you're going to give them the mortgage. And you're going to use your title to your land as collateral. But in order to get the mortgage, they require you to buy title insurance. And a lot of people don't know that they're actually required to get this. And when you buy title insurance, you actually buy two different policies. You buy a policy for yourself, and then you buy a policy for the bank. So the policy for yourself is called the owner's policy, and that covers the full amount of whatever the property value is worth. And then the bank's policy is called the lender's policy, and that covers whatever is left for you to pay. So say if you paid $100,000 on a $150,000 loan, they find out the title's defective, the title insurance will cover the extra $50,000 owed to the bank. But it will also cover the full amount for what the property is worth for you.
And not everybody knows that, huh?
Yeah, not everybody knows that. So these are the risks. So how does this relate to foreclosures?
They're ripping us off.
So title insurance covers fraud, failure of any person or entity to have authorized the transfer of conveyance, a title not properly executed or notarized, and on and on. And so within my letter, I say, the aforementioned coverages apply to all land titles in the Hawaiian Islands due to the failure to administer Hawaiian Kingdom law according to the Hague and Geneva Conventions. As covered risks, the lenders are protected regarding the debts owed to them by the borrowers, and the borrowers are protected if they purchase a title insurance policy. So essentially, foreclosures are unnecessary. We shouldn't be foreclosing on protected persons in Hawaii. This is the last paragraph of the UN Human Rights Memo that I showed you before. And he wrote about the ongoing plundering of the Hawaiian Islands, particularly of those heirs and descendants with land titles that originate from the distributions of land under the authority of the Hawaiian Kingdom. U.S. courts have to take international law and customary international law into account in property disputes. The state of Hawaii courts should not lend themselves to a flagrant violation of the rights of land title holders. Therefore, the courts of the state of Hawaii must not enable or collude in the wrongful taking of private lands. So I include this in the conclusion of my letter. And I say, as an agent for the United States, I am bound to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances, and therefore call upon you to cease and desist in the wrongful taking of private lands from protected persons that are under foreclosure. I haven't heard anything back. And here's my third letter. How many of you have heard of misprision of a felony? Okay, cool. Well, I'm about to teach you something. This is very interesting. So, war crimes are felonies. So any violation to federal law is a felony. And a war crime is a felony as well. Turns out, there's another code under Title 18 says that whoever having knowledge of the actual commission of a felony cognizable by a court of the United States conceals and does not as soon as possible make known the same to some judge or other person in civil military authority under the United States shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years, or both. So do you see where I'm going? So if I don't report war crimes, I'm committing a felony. So I reported Queens Hospital and circuit court judges to the FBI. And I say that as an elected official, I have a special duty and obligation to report crimes, especially severe crimes such as war crimes and the crime of genocide. I'm therefore reporting the Commission of War Crimes and the International Crime of Genocide to the FBI's field office in Kamehameha, pursuant to Title 18, misprision of a felony. And I haven't heard anything back either. And last week, I sent a letter to every department in Hawaii having to do with taxation, regarding war crimes of pillaging committed against protected persons by the state of Hawaii and its 4 counties. Okay, so remember, let's see first so pillage is the forcible taking of private property by an invading or conquering army for private or personal use. This is according to elements of a crime of the International Criminal Court. Then plunder means to pillage or loot, according to Black's Law Dictionary. So I put those definitions in there. And remember what the Hague Geneva Convention said, that the laws of the occupied country need to be enforced? Yep. Well, let's see what the Hawaiian Kingdom laws on taxation are. This is what if the U.S. were to comply, this is what we would be paying. Our tax on real property would be really low. 3/4 of 1% of the value versus whatever 7 or 10% depending on where you're living now. A poll tax of $1, which at inflation would be about $27. A school tax of inflation would be about $55. A tax on dogs would be about $28. A tax on horses, mares, and colts for $20 each. Mules, a road tax, and a tax on personal property, which would be 3/4% or 1% of whatever you own. So it would be a lot less. So when the United States assumed control over the regime it had established in 1893, under a new label, the Territory of Hawaii, and then later a new label, the Republic of Hawaii, and then the new label, the State of Hawaii, it went beyond its limits of U.S. authority. So like I said, the U.S. doesn't have authority to establish governments in other countries. It can't establish a government in Canada, as it cannot establish a government in Hawaii. So since congressional legislation doesn't have an effect beyond its own borders, it cannot, So because it cannot claim to be a lawful government because its authority derives from congressional legislation that has no extraterritorial effect, which means beyond its own territory. So therefore, the state of Hawaii meets the international definition of an organized armed group acting for and on behalf of the United States within the territories of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So I explained to them how the state of Hawaii is essentially a private armed force operating in Hawaii. I say, as the power to collect taxes is the prerogative of a bona fide government, the state of Hawaii and its 4 counties being an armed force are disabled from assessing taxes from protected persons under the guise of taxation. As an armed force, any collection of these monies from protected persons is pillaging. I also talk about, in the end of it, the conclusion of my letter, I referred to Dr. Tsai's report to Mike McCartney. So when I had met with Dr. Tsai, he told me that he met with the governor's chief of staff. His name is Mike McCartney. He met with him 4 times. I explained to him a remedy for getting out of this mess, and he made a report to him, and it's called the McCartney Report. And it talks about how the governor is obligated to transform the state of Hawaii into a military government to start administering the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And this is a remedy for the state of Hawaii to take seriously. Otherwise, war crimes will continue to be committed with impunity. And so in every one of these letters, I CC the Office of the Prosecutor, the International Criminal Court, the President of the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Expert for the Promotion of Democratic and Equitable Order. That was Dr. Desaias, the one who wrote that memo. The International Committee of the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and the Human Rights Watch. And I will be sending more letters before my term is up in about a week and a half. And speaking of, I will be taking these letters along with all of the testimony of the protected persons that came out that Keawe was talking about, along with a lot of other evidence to New York to meet with these nonprofits, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Committee of the Red Cross, because they all make reports to the International Criminal Court. And so I'm going to request that they appoint a special rapporteur to start documenting the human rights violations happening in Hawaii. No, I haven't. In fact, I've requested, I did contact them for a meeting. They haven't gotten back to me, so I just keep sending them these letters. And
Maybe you gotta knock on their
what we're
door.
going to do, yeah, I'm just going to go straight to New York and knock on their door and see if I can sit down with them.
It could happen.
So, in conclusion, as a legislator, I learned that Hawaii was never legally made part of the United States, and because of that, the laws of occupation apply. So, those laws are outlined in the Hague and Geneva Conventions, which specify that I must ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances, and that is in alignment with my oath of office, which says treaty that is supreme law of the land. These conventions are U.S. ratified treaties. And all these letters are on my website. They're all public. Everything I receive is online. So you can find them on jenruggles.com, latest updates. I publish press releases as I confirm each department got the letter. So I send them certified mail, and then I receive a receipt once somebody signed to get it. And so far I've received receipts from everyone I sent them to. I've confirmed that David Ige did in fact get my letter on pillaging last week, so I published the press release. I've actually been pretty disappointed with the amount of press coverage this has gotten. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. They're distorting the issue to be about my paycheck and me not doing my job. I almost wanted to Keawe wanted me to tell him what the name of my presentation was going to be. And at first I thought, why I'm not giving up my paycheck or resigning. Description proved me wrong. Yeah, I think you guys have been seeing how the newspaper's been framing it. They're trying to distract from the issue that there are war crimes being committed in Hawaii, and that Corporation Council couldn't dispute that Hawaii is illegally occupied. That's what they should be focusing on. Mr. Kamehameha's letter that didn't dispute the illegal occupation, not my paycheck or how I'm not doing my job. So as you can see, I have been doing my job in accordance with my oath of office. So again, my letters are on my website. Please use them. They're meant to be templates as well for you to help educate your friends or family and start putting people you know on notice.
Hello everyone, my name is Nadine Noelani Aquino. I have been an advocate for the Queen's Hospital Charter, the Queen's Charter. This is the original charter for the Queen's Hospital from Queen Emma. Her handwriting, her own handwriting. I've been an advocate since 2010. How I got hold of it was a cousin had been to the archives. And she had made me a copy, had it certified. And my goal in my life was to share this with everyone in Hawaii. Now, Queen Emma had made this, and there's a story. Thank you, Walter Reedy, for helping me and do the research. And he even went on the video and to tell everyone about the Queen's Hospital. Well, I am that cousin that had shared that information. Anyone interested in the charter, come see me. I will send it to your email. See, we use our technology nowadays, right? Yeah. So, what does the charter consist of? The charter consists of free medical to those who do not have the kala, the money, to go into the hospital. So I got my... Okay, and so, Queen Emma, with her husband, the fourth, went to house to collect the money. Queen Emma donated her land and get the money to build the hospital. Now, her condition was, I will give you the land, I will give you the hospital, on the condition that if any of my people of Hawaii, and especially my people, the Kanaka, the Hawaiians, come to the door and have no money, you shall render full service. Now, some say this doesn't work. I just came from Queen's Hospital. My daughter had to do an emergency surgery. Asked me if I had to pay anything. No, I gave them the charter. This is her handwriting. I have.
Okay, what you can do is give me your email address, and if any of you would like to get that information sent to me, we're going to send it to Sister over here.
So this is Queen Emma. This is what our queens give to us. So I know I gave to a lot of cousins, but all I ask you is to pass it to everyone. It's free of charge. The more we get the information out there, the more people are going to go to Queens and say, hello, right? Because in 2010, when I went to the CEOs at Queen's Hospital, they said the Hawaiians were a charity. They forgot where they got it from. So I just want to share that
Again, as all of you come here, we're learning more and more and more, about what happened, what's available, and what we can do. First off, how many of you have gone to this table here and taken a look at the Kūʻokoʻa petition? Raise your hand. If you haven't done it, and you think you might have ʻohana that may have signed the Kūʻokoʻa petition, okay, the Kūʻokoʻa petition was instrumental in getting the United States Senate to vote against annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1897. And now imagine this. It just took the Hawaiians who started the Kūʻokoʻa petition just a few months to go around to all the islands and gather signatures. I think it was about 38,000 signatures total to submit to the U.S. Senate in protest of the Treaty of Annexation that was being proposed for ratification. When they received the Kūʻokoʻa petition, this caused the senators that were going to vote for this illegal annexation to vote against it. And so if you have ʻohana that were living here, whether they're Hawaiian, Japanese, Filipino, they signed the Kūʻokoʻa petition. So it takes some time to go talk to Linda, over there, and see if your ʻohana signed the Kūʻokoʻa petition. Okay? So what we're going to do right now is just take a quick 20-25 minute break so that you guys, I know you're hungry, can go and get your plate lunches. It's really fun. Pulo pig, cabbage, rice, mac salad, and whatever else you have. But grab your plate lunches and please come right back because we're going to start right away. We're running behind, so we'll get them in late so that we can fuel you for the second hand. Lie in and sit at their tables so that we can get started. Because I assure you, you do not want to miss the next two presenters that we have. And so it's very important that all of you gather around. And I know the mail item that we had is Ono, and a big mahalo going out to Jim Keawe and his ohana in the preparation of the mail item that you guys are able to partake in. So how about a hand for Jim Keawe and his ohana. You know, it's also nice to see that people have taken the time off to take a look at the Kūʻokoʻa petitions that Linda was able to bring, and she's going to be following us not only here but also up in Kohala. We're going to be up in Kohala tomorrow morning. So for those of you who would like to drive up to Kohala, please come and join us. As we're going to have Kamala Beamer that's going to be speaking, as well as Dr. Ron Williams, who's also going to be speaking up there. Okay? So, before we proceed, Councilwoman Jen Ruggles wanted to remind everybody about a very important thing that all of us need to do.
Thank you. So a lot of people in this circumstance. Yeah, and that this is a legitimate question, and it deserves a legitimate answer. So letters to the editor, the Hawaii Tribune Herald, West Hawaii Today, and commenting on any more of their, if they do any more articles about me, just trying to set the record straight, because they're publishing things that are not true. Just straight up not. They're trying to say that Tom Callis published that Texas was annexed by resolution. Therefore, it's okay that they annexed. That's not true. Texas was annexed by treaty. Anyway, yeah. So there's a lot of things that need to be corrected. We gotta start holding the press accountable. Thank you.
I'm very excited to introduce our next presenter, because I've been trying to get him for the last 2 years to come to Hawaii Island to be a presenter, and I was fortunate enough to meet him and interview him on a TV show that I had on Oahu, Kanaka Express. And after, during the interview, I was just really not floored, but very surprised and glad that I got to meet this gentleman. And what's incredible is the vast understanding and knowledge that he has of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the Hawaiian language, and the history of Hawaii. Dr. Niklaus Schweitzer is the former consulate from Switzerland to Hawaii. And after he retired from being the consulate for Switzerland, then he went on to teach at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And prior to that, he was also teaching at Punahou, unfortunately.
No, very good.
That was the unfortunate part. When you go teach at Punahou, already. Okay, but he redeemed himself, when he became the consulate from Switzerland, and then started teaching at UH Manoa.
There you go.
And But that's okay, we adopted him, you know, even though he was at Punahou for a short period of time. So, I'd like to introduce my friend, Dr. Nicholas Schweitzer.
Mahalo nui e oe e kale, ame mahalo nui no o ko, no ko no ana mai iau, e ke mokupuni nani loa kapai o ka mokupuni o Keawe. But now I will go into English. And you know, Puna, that was very interesting because it was very much like the school I had attended in Zurich, Switzerland, but I felt that something was not right, but I couldn't put my fingers on it. What was it? Something was strange. And it really started, in a way, my research on the entire Hawaiian situation. Also, when I arrived, I came by ship because I wanted to see how far away Hawaii really is. And it's almost like crossing the Atlantic, which I've been several times. And when we put into the harbor, I suddenly heard the band play a German march. What is this? German march? So I ran to the railing, looked down. There was a band all in white, a beautiful hula girl. Which band do you think this was? Royal Hawaiian Band, and the march they played was the Hilo March. And I noticed there was a German influence, so how is that? Also the palace, which at that time was in a dilapidated condition with all kinds of cubicles attached to the lanai. The throne room spoke of earlier grandeur, but it was all run down. And then I started questions, and nobody wanted to answer them, or could answer them, I don't know. Very much like Kale, when he was a boy. I went through the same stage. And then the more I did research, the more interesting it got. And so, after all these years, and also being the Swiss diplomat here, also not only Switzerland, I represented ex officio a very small country, maybe you have not even heard of it, Liechtenstein. Anyone heard of Liechtenstein? It's a German-speaking monarchy. And we, in Switzerland, are very proud of Switzerland being the second oldest republic in the world. And so to represent the republic and the monarchy at the same time was very interesting because there were quite some telling differences in these forms of government. Anyway, so today we celebrate 175 years of the declaration by which two countries, that Hawaii is accorded international recognition. Which countries? Yes, England and France. And I always wondered about that. Why England and France? Of course, they were the main colonizers in the Pacific and in Asia and in Africa. After the Spaniards, whose sun was already setting slowly, and some other colonial powers. But why would these two work together? Because throughout the 19th century, or most of the 19th century, they were not, if enemies, at least opponents. And so I began to study this whole thing. So on this day, meaning the 28th, we're not quite there yet, in 1843, a momentous event occurred. The publication of a joint declaration by France and Great Britain to the effect that there existed in the Hawaiian Islands a well-functioning government, which really speaks to the statecraft of Hawaiians. We heard in the previous presentations how smart they really were and are, and how they managed, you know, in very tough times to build something solid on which we can stand today. Now, why is this such a great achievement? We have an international lawyer, John Westlake, a leading expert in the field, who wrote in 1893 this very critical year, 1893, I quote, "The international society to which we belong, and of which what we know as international law is the body of rules, comprises, first of all the European states. These, as explained in speaking of the Peace of Westphalia, form a system intimately bound together by the interest of its members." Who knows what the Peace of Westphalia was? Well, in Europe we had plenty of wars. And we had one war which lasted for 30 years, 1618 to 1648. It was between the Catholics and the Protestants. And finally, after 30 years of fighting, they concluded this peace in an area in Germany which is called Westphalia. And the modern nation state, as we now know it, comes from there. Also, international etiquette, all these rules come really from this Westphalian peace. So, all the European states are independent, says Westphal. Secondly, all American states. These, on becoming independent, inherited the international law of Europe, as will be seen in the next paragraph. And they are as necessary parties as the European states of its further development. That they do not form part politically of the European system is due to the fact that they do not desire to do so. Now it gets interesting. Thirdly, a few Christian states in other parts of the world. As, guess which country? The Hawaiian Islands. Then he adds Liberia and the Orange Free State. Orange Free State is in South Africa. Liberia is still independent, but here is Hawaii. And this was achieved through this international declaration by the two countries you mentioned before. Now, Hawaii reached this status as the first non-Western country in the world. Of course, it was in the process of adopting Western laws and institutions, but it is in a part of the world which normally is not counted as a part of the West. And what's also surprising is that this mid-Pacific kingdom did so long before China or Japan or Australia or New Zealand, even Canada. In fact, when Hawaii entered this very special club, it's the most exclusive club you can possibly be in, the Club of Independent Countries. When Hawaii entered this club, there were only 44 members. How many independent countries do we have today? Yeah, almost 200. I think it's 198 at the moment. How was such a feat accomplished? In my opinion, it has much to do with an innate diplomatic skill of the keiki o Kamehameha, honed over centuries of island kingdoms, shifting up and down the Hawaiian chain. So when we talk about monarchy here, how old is monarchy in these islands? Institution of monarchy. What would we say?
Kamehameha #4.
Because way before Kamehameha, who was, as we know, a very great king, I would say it's about 1,000 years old. So that gives it extra weight. And because of this innate diplomatic skill which you need when you have competing kingdoms, when Cook was here, there were 4 kingdoms, and they were often in a state of war. You need diplomatic skill, otherwise you fight forever. And so that's how they were trained, and no wonder Hawaiians were and are great diplomats. So, Keawe, of whom we heard a lot already, and his ali'i decided to send a diplomatic mission to the 2 major colonizers to get a statement from them as to the independence of Hawaii. The lead diplomat was a Hawaiian chief by the name of Timoteo Ha'awilio.
I didn't get to
Then part of the embassy was a missionary who had become an advisor, and of the missionaries he was one really of the few who truly tried to understand Hawaiians and their culture. So William Richards, very important, Likeke in Hawaii. And there was a British gentleman who became part of this diplomatic mission. Who was that? George Simpson of the Hudson's Bay Company. Now what's the Hudson's Bay Company? It's a huge British firm in what they call Canada today. Dealing in furs, but dealing in all kinds of other things. Shovels and, lomi salmon we have because of them. And lots of other goods. And they established a fort on the Columbia River already in 1824, and then they established a subsidiary in Honolulu. Now Honolulu at that time was what we call an off-boat. Off-boat means a harbor free to everyone. International harbor, a little bit like what the role of Hong Kong was later, not anymore, because now they have reverted to China, but when they were a British colony, they were also a kind of entrepot. And so to the British, also to the Germans, who were very important here, because the biggest of the big five was a German firm until 1917, 1918. It was most important to keep Hawaii independent so they could do their business. So these three set out for Europe. Now it's very interesting that Ha'awilio and Richards went together and Simpson went all on his own. Ha'awilio and Richards went to Mexico, and then on mules to Veracruz they crossed the isthmus, and then took a ship to New York, and they went to Washington, D.C. to get a declaration from the State Department. They got an oral recognition, but not a written one. So the U.S. dragged its feet. Now and then they went on to Paris and London. Simpson, however, since he was a British citizen, could not set foot upon U.S. territory. Because at that time, we're talking now about 1842 and 43, the border between British North America and the US in the West had not yet been established. In the East, yes, that was in the war of 1812 to 1814. In the West, it was open, and he could have been arrested. So instead, he went to Russian America. What's that? Alaska. He went to Novo Arkhangelsk, which we also call Sitka. There he took a Russian ship to Okhotsk, which is on the Russian Pacific coast. Now here we have a map. So you see Alaska up there, right? And then Okhotsk is here. And then, guess what? He traveled the length of Russia. And how long do you think it took? This is before the Transsib, the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
It took a couple months.
It took him 99 days. Partly on the horseback, partly on a boat along the Lena River, which is one of the Siberian rivers, after whom one certain Ulyanov got his nickname Lenin, comes from Lena, and then by carriage. And it was an absolutely incredible trip. And if you want to find out what that was like, we have a great short story by the famous writer Pushkin, Stazione Smontriel, which means station master, because the Russians, in order to rule this immense country, which by the way is the biggest country in the world, 11 time zones. If you think that there are already a number of time zones in the continental US, what about 11 time zones? So to control the country and also to expedite travel, they had postal stations at the distance of a 1 day's journey. Here I have a picture. These station masters would look like this, and you could have a bed, you could sleep there, they would cook your dinner and would have a cup of tea. This is a very interesting story because a aristocrat seduces the poor guy's daughter, and he then eventually succumbs to alcohol, and later an elegant lady with 3 very lively young boys appears in a coach with 6 horses. That's his daughter, because the guy who abducted her, married her, made her an aristocrat. Anyway, that's the story. But to appreciate Simpson's incredible voyage, one should really read this. Simpson managed to arrive in London before the other 2. And so he could apprise the good officials in Whitehall, meaning the British Foreign Ministry, of what this mission was all about. And so when the other 2 finally arrived, they had open ears. Then, however, they went to Brussels. In which country is that?
Netherlands.
Brussels. Belgium.
Netherlands.
And they actually got the very first recognition of Hawaii's independence from Belgium. Why would that be the case? So that's even before France and Britain. Well, we have to know European history a little bit. Belgium broke away from the Netherlands in 1831 and established itself. So 1843, they had a need to be recognized by other independent countries, and so Hawaii was one of those that came in very handy. And so to reciprocate, they also recognized Hawaii. What about the US? When did the US recognize Hawaii in writing? Does anyone know? Yes, 1 year later, finally we have a recognition by the US. But the British-French one is really the most famous, and that was on the 28th of November.
Independence Day.
So, what does it mean? Here we have a German map. The year is 1859. We have all the colonial powers. So here, for instance, the Spanish. This is still Spanish here, the Philippines, right? Then we have the Dutch in what today is Indonesia. Then we have the English, New Zealand, Australia, India, what today is Pakistan, lots of Asian countries today. We have the US, which is in the Line Islands. So it says American Polynesia, that's what it says here. 1859, aren't you? The French, where the French, what's this? Where the Hawaiians originally came from?
Tahiti.
The Marquesas, not Tahiti, not yet, but they had a protectorate. The Haitians still had their own government. But in the Marquesas, they had the next, this in 1842. And then, of course, the US, the British, North America, which we call Canada. And here, what does it say? It says Reich Kamehameha, meaning the empire of Kamehameha. So, with all these colonial powers, Hawaii is recognized as an independent state. That's why this map is so important. Now, to go on a little bit, so after protracted negotiations, as I said, the British and the French signed this declaration, which you have here in this wonderful publication by Dr. Keawe, which you have. Here you see the seals and everything. That's what an international treaty looks like. And that was a huge plum. Now the three Hawaiian diplomats were aided by a curious twist in world history. Namely the fact that for a short period of time there existed what we can call an entente cordiale between France and Britain, meaning a kind of an alliance between two countries that usually, as I said, were opponents throughout the 19th century. And this was because of Argentina. Who would have thought of that? Argentina was an interesting market for both the French and the English, and also the US and many other countries. But it had the government had gone to a president who wanted to follow a period of isolationism. And the French and the British did not like this, and they teamed up and finally, in a naval battle, forced Argentina to open its doors again. A little bit like Japan. Now, what role does this play in connection with Hawaii? This is why the two, France and England, worked together for a few years. And this was the window of opportunity for our three great diplomats. If they had tried to get a declaration of a recognition of independence a few years before from Britain and France, they would have failed. If they had tried a few years later, they would have also failed. But 1843 was it. And so history for a change worked for Hawaii. So for today, the high status of Hawaii achieved in 1843 means that our modern discourse should primarily evolve on the national and not so much on the ethnic level. And we discussed this already. The ethnic level is important too, but the national level is even more important. And we should be aware of that. And also interesting is that Hawaii's breakthrough on the global level on November 28, 1843, in the decades to follow greatly helped to perpetuate the perpetual quest of the monarchy to fortify and strengthen this enviable position. And so we have no fewer than 46 international treaties, including friendship, residency and commercial treaties with major players such as Austria-Hungary, France, the German Empire, Great Britain, the Russian Empire, the United States, and even my own country, the Swiss Confederation. If you want to study all of this, go to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which is also mentioned, and we could do much better there. We're trying to improve things. But we have, to my great surprise, on the second floor, a huge collection called the Consolidated Treaty Series. And it consists of 220 volumes. 220 volumes, 12 volumes containing the index alone. But what does it do? It registers every single international treaty concluded between 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, which I mentioned before, and 1918. Why 1918? End of World War I. We just commemorated that in Paris, right? And when you look it up under Hawaii, we have all the treaties listed. But of course, you don't have a treaty in, say, 1893 or 1898. It doesn't exist. But there is mention of a diplomatic note 1887, and that had something to do with leasing Pearl Harbor. So that's the last treaty we have with the US, and nothing afterwards. But we have such treaties as with the Hanseatic city of Bremen, which was an independent country at the time, with Hamburg, with all other kinds of countries. So go there to Hamilton Library and have a look. It's very elucidating. Along those lines, there's also a diplomatic note of January 18th, 1893. Lily Kūʻokoʻa, wasn't she overthrown on the 17th? So how come there is a diplomatic note dating to the 18th? Well, this is a note which acknowledges Japan's full sovereignty. And it had been in the works for a number of weeks. And Hawaii's ambassador to Tokyo, since there was no telephone line, there was no tweeting, had no idea what happened on the 17th, and so he followed through and handed this note to the Japanese foreign minister. And the note said that from now on, Hawaii would drop the stipulation that when a Hawaiian subject became a court case, only the Hawaiian consul could adjudicate the case and the Japanese couldn't. This was a restrictive clause which the other countries had imposed upon Japan already in 1871, and Hawaii enjoyed the same privileges. Kūʻokoʻa already wanted to lift this when he was in Japan in 1881, but then one of his members of the entourage intervened, went to the US ambassador, told him what Kūʻokoʻa was about to do, and so he got stopped. Because the moment Hawaii recognized Japan fully, everybody else had to do the same thing. That's how international diplomacy works. And so Lili Uokalani finally succeeded. It's one of her greatest moments, and the irony is she succeeded one day after they had overthrown her. So that's very special. So throughout much of the 19th century, Hawaii was blessed with very good leadership. This became particularly evident in the reign of Queen Liliuokalani, who herself was an exceptionally talented head of state and who was surrounded by sterling statesmen and highly accomplished women. We heard that also. I'm referring to the Navahi, Josepa and Raima, Abigail Maipine or Mrs. James Campbell, and then of course the great diplomats James Kaulia of Hui Aloha Aina and David Kalauo Kolami of the Hui Kalai Aina. And there were Loyal Howley. One of my predecessors referred to that too. Loyal Howley, such as Paul Isenberg, German Jew, by the way, who defended her in this kangaroo court in her throne room in 1895. Herman Wiedemann, whom I had the honor to play in the street theater during Onipa, when we showed exactly what had happened 100 years earlier, who said what and why and so forth. So I played a German sugar planter who also had been a justice of the Supreme Court. Charles T. Gulick, a cousin of the missionary Gulick. I always wondered, why does he have a street, an avenue actually, in Kalihi? Because all the missionary streets and avenues are where? Manoa and Nu'uanu, not in Kalihi. Why Kalihi? Well, because he fought for the Queen. He was imprisoned, and when Kohio helped build the city and county proved grateful, and therefore named that avenue Gulick Avenue. So these are the so-called good towns. And we also have a senator who really intrigues me. That Senator Richard Franklin Pettigrew. Ever heard of him? Pettigrew was a Republican, that's interesting. And he was from South Dakota. And he was the one who led the fight against annexation in the US Senate, and they said everything is wrong and they cannot do this. And when they came with this joint resolution and it was passed, by the way, it was only passed because of the Spanish-American War, which happened at the time, and it was represented to those who were against it, that they were unpatriotic and because the country was in a state of war. Well, when it was, just before it was passed, he tried to make an amendment that Hawaiians should be able to vote on whether or not they wanted to be annexed. Of course, the amendment was defeated, but he wrote 2 interesting books about that. And also in that secret meeting of the US Senate of May 31st, 1898, that you have to read, because we have the minutes in Hamilton Library. And you can see who argued how. And that's where he really showed these other gentlemen that they were all wrong. By the way, he introduced the filibuster when his amendment failed. And the filibuster was at first successful, but you know, all of this took place in June and July, and what's the weather like in DC at that time?
Hot as hell.
And they had no air conditioning. So they literally melted away, and that's what ended the filibuster. So you see all these chinks and strange turns, but what's so encouraging is what's happening now. And thanks to you, thanks to such courageous ladies as your great councilwoman who's right over there, thanks to all the research which is now coming out at the University of Hawaii, we are really on a very solid path. I just want to say one more thing about Timoteo Ha'awili'o, because he's also a hero. He was sick, he had a lung disease, and still he did give everything he had. And there is a moving letter which just recently surfaced. It's in Hawaiian. It's in the Ali'i letter collection at the missionary houses and at the museum. And he writes his mother from London, from his hotel. And he says, you know, I'm homesick, I'm also physically sick, and it's cold, I'm in a cold foreign country, but I tried my very best to help Hawaii. No leila, e holo mua kako, me ka ikeka, me ke aloha pu me hana. Mahalo. Questions maybe, because this is kind of arcane, you know, international diplomacy, and treaties, and international law, and all of that. Yes? Yes.
They'll basically secure figures until your vacancies, and then they'll come and remove them from their seat of power. So I'm just wondering, you know, a telegram, antiquated, or is that still like a formula for this country?
No, you can go to the Security Council, but the problem with the Security Council, what is it? It's a grand institution, but there are several countries that have the veto power, and guess which these countries are? Yes, it's wonderful. The China, the Russians, France and Britain have the veto power, so you can send as many telegrams you like, and they will simply veto it at this point. So what, yes, there's a question. Can you speak up a little bit? No, they were, well, as I said, Richards and Leo went to Mexico and then crossed the isthmus and then took a ship to New York and then went to DC and back to New York and then to Europe, and Simpson went by way of Russian America, meaning Alaska, and then the Russian Far East, and then they met in London. But he was there first, and therefore he could already prepare the ground. He was very well connected because the Hudson's Bay Company was a huge, important firm in the British scheme of things. Yes? Yes. It's a short story by the great Russian writer Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin. And in English translation it's called The Station Master. And here's a picture of the station master. So he went from one postal station to the other, crossing the length of Russia. And so this story is interesting to understand what that really meant. Because now you can fly, or you can take the Trans-Siberian Express, which is very comfortable, but even the Trans-Siberian Express takes 8 days. So before the railroad, you can imagine how long it took. 99 days. So these gentlemen were really very courageous, very smart, and very successful.
What I have for Dr.